On Sunday, the 10th of August, a couple of us decided to come to Coniston Water for a dive. We came here on a regular basis as a dive club, and we got quite a way down, 16 minutes actually from the start point, and we came across a package in the water. The package loomed up out the silt, and it was nearly floating, and I thought, I wonder what that is. It was too heavy to lift by hand. On the Wednesday, we decided to come back with all the gear necessary to lift the package, pulled it into the shoreline. I got a knife and cut the package open, thinking it was going to be some sort of treasure. But it wasn't what we were wanting to find. It looked very much like a body to me.
It was a pitch-black evening. I wasn't actually on call that night, but a colleague wasn't able to attend, so I went to Ulverston to get our car and set off around the east side of Coniston.
In August 1997, amateur divers retrieved what they believed to be a body from the depths of Coniston Water.
Local divers had stumbled across their find, wrapped in plastic and held down with weights.
At the time, Doug Marshall was a detective constable for Cumbria Police.
All I'd been told was that a body had been found in the lake. On the way, I was thinking of making sure that we preserve the body, preserve the scene, and make sure that any forensic evidence was retained. When I arrived, we had a scenes of crime officer who was working diligently in setting up the scene and cordoning it off, lit up the area. I was able to then go down to what could only be described as a package at that point. But as I got closer to the package, I could see the remains of a head. And it was immediately clear that it was a body that had been wrapped very carefully and very tightly in plastic bin liners and covered in ropes and knots in what could only be described as a fetal-type position. It was somebody and had gone to quite great lengths to wrap the body and hope that it never got found again. My priorities then were to get in touch with the senior investigating officer team, who then drove round to Coniston, and I was able to brief them on what had happened.
Over the years, we've got all sorts out the lake, outboard motors and ammunition and even revolvers, but not this sort of thing. So absolutely loads of people turned up, plain clothes, more panda cards, it was everything.
In terms of examination of the package, it was really paramount at that time that I tried to keep as many people away from it as possible and that we didn't look too closely because we had to be aware of forensics. There was 2 post-mortem examinations carried out, one the next day after the body had been recovered, and it was a very long, laborious process because it was really important to secure packaging around the body, the ropes, and any knots that were tied. The immediate priorities in the investigation was to try and find out who this person was.
The body had been in the water for some time, and forensic pathologist Peter Venezes knows only too well the difficulties that would have been faced by the original pathologist, Dr. Edmund Tapp, in making an identification.
The
relation to anybody which has been in water for a long period of time, identification is quite a challenge because there won't be very much left. There will be mostly bones, skeleton left. All you would get is a general idea of the person. For example, you can estimate their height, you can say what sex they were, that kind of thing.
There were issues around getting DNA from a body that had been in the water for such a long time, so a decision was made to focus on the teeth of the deceased. To do that, we got in an odontologist, an expert in the study of teeth. That expert came along and was able to do a reconstruction of the mouth of the deceased and where certain teeth that were loose would have been.
But the reconstruction was only part of the jigsaw. Now the police needed some dental records to match it up to.
Press releases went out about the recovery of a body from the lake, and the public were encouraged to try and assist with who that might be.
Jeremy Craddock was a reporter at the local paper, the Westmoreland Gazette, at the time of the gruesome discovery.
They were putting out appeals publicly. Anyone with any information, anybody that, members of the public, if they thought somebody was missing, making suggestions. So my initial reports in the paper were along those lines. I think there was a lot of shock in the Lake District. And obviously people started to speculate about who the body was.
There was a number of names mentioned, but the name Carol Park came up very early on in the investigation and mentioned by more than one person.
With a possible strong lead, would the dental reconstruction match those of Carol Park?
In order to do a comparison, it was really important to try and get some information about dentistry involving people who we thought might be the deceased person. We managed to find out that Carol Park used to go to a dentist in Barrow-in-Furness. We were led to a garage where there was storage of a load of records pertaining to teeth, and I do vividly recall sitting in a dusty garage for a whole afternoon to try and find Carol's impression. And of course, in one of the last boxes, I held up a record, and it was that of Carol Price, which was Carol's maiden name. And when comparisons were carried out, it was then clear that the body that had been recovered from the lake was that of Carol Park.
Carol had been missing for 21 years. In August 1997, a group of amateur divers found a body wrapped in bags and bound tightly with ropes in the depths of Coniston Water in the Lake District. Dental records had been used to identify that the remains belonged to 30-year-old Carol Park, who had gone missing 21 years earlier in 1976.
Once the police formally identified Carol, obviously from a journalist's point of view, time to start gathering facts and information about her. She'd been a school teacher from Barrow-in-Furness. She'd married Gordon Park, another school teacher, when they were both quite young. They both lived in Barrow, but they moved to a small village outside of Barrow called Lees.
We're in Lees, a small rural village in stark contrast to the industrial town of Barrow-in-Furness, only a few miles away. This was the sort of place where everybody knew everybody's business, and Gordon built the marital home of Bluestones in Lees, which he and Carol moved into after the marriage.
Following their wedding in 1967, Carol and Gordon went on to have 3 children, but Carol's niece, Kay Washford, recalls the marriage was far from happy.
I know that she'd been to my dad a few times because of relationship problems with Gordon. Gordon was a very stern man. He had rules that needed to be followed. If you didn't follow them rules, it would make things very difficult. All I did was witness Carol very upset and crying, and my dad consoling her.
There was a lot of arguments. There'd been several separations, and Carol had left Gordon on a number of occasions. There were also speculation that both Carol and Gordon had had extramarital relationships. Carol had a number of relationships with other men, but the main one that she had was with a man from the northeast. And eventually, Carol left Gordon to be with him.
After a court case where she was potentially going to lose her children, Carol decided to return to the marital home and resume her marriage with Gordon.
Carol found the wrench of being separate from her children too much.
In August 1975, Carol returned to Gordon, but less than a year later, on the 17th of July 1976, she went missing.
She'd broke up for the school holidays on the 16th of July.
The family had planned to take a trip to Blackpool to take the children to the fun fair and also to a Doctor Who exhibition. But on the morning, Gordon Park said that Carol didn't want to go. She said she wasn't feeling well.
He said that he took the children to Blackpool on his own, and when he returned that evening, that Carol had gone.
There was no sign, there was no note, but they found her wedding ring and engagement ring on the bedside table. The missing persons inquiry in 1976 didn't really get anywhere because there wasn't really much to go on. There was a history of Carol leaving Gordon in the past, and these were obviously days before, you know, before the internet, before CCTV.
These days, there's a lot of information open to police to trace financial records, mobile phone records, checking CCTV, lots of them things that weren't available in 1976.
And it was another missing person case that was kind of shelved until something concrete came forward, really.
Mrs. Park's disappearance made only the local headlines. How was it, people asked, that she could go missing from her home in Leith while her husband and 3 young children were on a day trip to Blackpool?
But one thing that had roused police suspicions at the time was that although Carol went missing on July the 17th, Gordon Park didn't report her disappearance until September the 4th, 6 weeks later.
He said she always was leaving him, she'd done it before, and eventually she'd always come back to him. So he didn't give it a second thought.
He said, oh, here we go again, she's gone off with another man. However, this was a very different set of circumstances to when Carol had gone away previously. People always knew she'd gone, knew where she'd gone, and she kept in touch with people. However, on this occasion, she'd gone and just disappeared, vanished.
It was actually when he went to see Ivor Price, Carol's brother, to tell him that Carol had gone missing. And I think Ivor Price was alarmed that nothing had been done up until that point.
When Gordon came and said, well, she disappeared a few weeks ago, my dad was quite angry. I do remember that. And he says, you need to go to the police. You should have reported her missing by now.
Most people perhaps would go straight to the police in those circumstances. Gordon Park chose to notify his solicitor, who then notified the police. And police at the time who spoke to him about Carol Park's disappearance said how odd that was.
In the years that followed Carol's disappearance, Gordon moved on with his life and he divorced her on the grounds of desertion.
He said that his wife had walked out on him. He didn't know where she was. So he said somebody had to bring those children up, and that's what he did. He continued to pursue his interests of climbing and sailing.
He used to go sailing a lot. He had his boat. And, yeah, he took me and my sister Debbie and his own children on that boat, sailing on Coniston.
He remarried in the early 80s, didn't last for very long. He married for a third time in the early 1990s to a woman that he'd known probably from the time that he first met Carol, actually, and they reignited their relationship.
But the August 1997 discovery of Carol's body was about to change the lives of Gordon Park and the rest of her relatives.
For Gordon Park and her children, this must have been a real shock, certainly to the children. For Ivor Price, at long last, he knew what had happened to his sister.
Gordon gave the explanation of that she'd gone away, she'd run off with another man. But my dad could never, he could never believe that she would go away for that length of time and leave the children.
I do not know what the immediate future is going to bring to our family. It will end a nightmare for me of 21 years, which has given me a living hell. But having said all that, whilst I'll know what happened, hopefully, it's still going to be another nightmare, perhaps even more horrendous than the one I've been through.
From the way in which Carol's body had been wrapped and disposed of, it was clear from the start that this was a murder inquiry.
There was some bin liners around the package, and Carol had actually been tied up in one of her own dresses. And it appeared that the body had been weighted down with some sort of lead piping.
It was the job of original forensic pathologist Dr. Tapp to establish how Carol had been killed.
I think Dr. Tapp was quite challenged with this case because of the time she'd been in water and the degree of decomposition. I'm amazed he found what he actually found. There's obviously evidence that she had fractures to her cheekbones.
The pathologist was of the opinion that the cause of death was due to the striking to the head with an instrument.
Her face had been disintegrated into quite a few pieces.
There was evidence of defensive wounds to one of the hands of Carol Park, and the bones to the hand were recovered.
She'd been beaten with an axe or meat chopper, tied up, her own dress turned into a makeshift sack, still wearing the baby doll nightie she'd last been seen in.
But the chance of retrieving any DNA evidence from the body and the packaging surrounding it, which could point to Carol's killer, was severely limited, as forensic scientist Hazel Johnson explains.
It would have been challenging to recover any foreign hairs or fibres from the body because the body was very much exposed to the elements, even though it was sort of deep in the lake. The water, the movement of the water would wash fibres and hairs off the body.
In 1997, there were also limitations in DNA technology, which was still in its infancy.
Certainly today you might be considering any DNA that might be preserved within the knot from the person who tied the knot. In 1997, the type of DNA that you would recover from the knot would not have been available.
Carol's body had been in Coniston water for 21 years. Because it was in water, there was no real DNA evidence.
The police realised they would have to use other forensic methods if they were going to find the culprit, and they already had a likely killer in mind. The discovery of Carol Park's body at the bottom of Coniston Water in 1997 had sparked a murder inquiry for Cumbria Police. And while there was no DNA evidence that could hold a clue to her killer, the police still had a number of suspects in mind.
Everybody that had any link to Carol Park was investigated thoroughly.
They were interested in the man that Carol Park had set up home with in the northeast. They were also interested in other men that Carol had had relationships with in the Barrow area at the time.
But whilst these men were quickly ruled out from early on in their investigation, one man had come to the fore as the prime suspect.
At the point of finding out the body was that of Carol Park, and the circumstances in which she'd gone missing, and the fact that she wasn't reported missing until months later, Gordon Park clearly became a suspect. When we started making inquiries, we found he was on holiday in France with his third wife.
Gordon heard about the discovery of Carol's body from his son. There was a phone call made. Gordon Park's reaction to that phone call was, "Oh dear." It seems an unusual response to being told that the wife that has been missing for 21 years has suddenly been discovered in Coniston Water.
Obviously, we couldn't speak to him at that point. However, a search of his premises did get carried out before he returned from France.
Immediately, the Barrow-in-Furness home of Gordon Park was searched, as was his boat moored on Coniston Water.
We were able to recover a number of items, knots and ropes from his garage.
It took him about 3 days to return from his holiday. Police made an early morning call at his house and arrested him.
Retired school teacher Gordon Park and his third wife returned from a cycling holiday to find Mr. Park a wanted man.
He was arrested pretty much on his return from France. In a serious murder investigation like this, it's really important to speak to a suspect as soon as possible. And particularly before they get an opportunity to interfere with potential witnesses. And that was the case with Gordon Park.
Detectives called this morning at the house Gordon Park shares with his third wife. She's believed to be inside with their children. He's being held at Barrow-in-Furness police station.
Gordon Park was arrested on the 24th of August 1997, 11 days after Carol's body was found.
It was huge news locally, and it had a real impact on Carol Park's wider family. You almost had two factions who were divided. The three children defending their father. But on the other side, you had Ivor Price, Carol's brother.
When Gordon was arrested, my dad was angry. He was saddened. I just don't think he could comprehend what was going on. And that Gordon was responsible for Carol's disappearance and murder. And to watch my dad go through what he was going through was just absolutely devastating.
Over the next 36 hours, we carried out about 10 interviews where we were able to go back to that period of his life to discuss very much about the day that Carol went missing and the proposed Blackpool trip and why he hadn't reported her missing until months later.
He was very defensive in interviews. He didn't really betray any emotions, he didn't get upset. But he did get quite irritated with the police's line of questioning. His argument really was that Carol Park had walked out on him before, and he believed that somebody else must have been responsible for her disappearance and for her death.
Gordon Park never made any admission of guilt during these interviews, but on the circumstantial evidence alone, he was charged with Carol's murder.
He was remanded into custody for a short period of time, a matter of a few weeks, before he was released on bail. There was enough evidence to charge and a realistic prospect of a conviction. However, it would appear that regional CPS didn't share that view. So on the 6th of January of 1998, Gordon Park had the charges dropped and he was then free to carry on his life.
En route to the committal to Crown Court, the Crown Prosecution Service made the sudden decision that there was, after all, insufficient evidence for a realistic prospect of conviction. The murder, dubbed as the Lady of the Lake case, remains a mystery unsolved.
There was great relief for Park's children and for his wife, but I guess in the wider community, there were probably a lot of people who thought Gordon Park was guilty.
That was quite difficult because you do start to think, well, have they got the right man or not? So everything is up in the air again and all the upset starts again and the stress of it.
It was a blow professionally that we hadn't been able to take this case to court, but that blow was magnified hundreds of times for Ivor Price and his family, having thought they were potentially going to get justice for Carol and then didn't. So I just resolved to just carry on with inquiries as much as I could, trying to look at any new lines that there might be. And it sort of became known in the station that if anybody came in with any information that it would land on my desk and I'd follow it up.
In early 2000, nearly 2 years after the charges were dropped against Gordon Park, Doug Marshall had a breakthrough.
I had a small catalogue put in my tray at work, and on the front of it was details of a knot expert who'd been involved in a number of criminal trials identifying knots. So I got in contact with this expert, and he was able to look at knots that had been tied around Carol's body, and he was able to look at knots recovered from Gordon Park's garage and came up with some very interesting knot tying styles and comparisons.
Gordon Park was a keen climber and sailor, and during the 1997 search of his house, many examples of knotted ropes had been taken as evidence.
A conclusion that he formed was that an average boatsman could tie around 8 knots, whereas Gordon Park's proficiency ranged to about 15. And he was also able to pick up on some idiosyncrasies in Gordon Park's knot tying at his home address, which was repeated on the package around Carol's body.
This forensic knot analysis was crucial in rebuilding a case against Gordon Park, and in the summer of 2000, there was a further breakthrough.
We'd done a documentary to try and find out if anybody could come forward with any further evidence in the case.
And a couple of former prisoners came forward and said that Gordon Park had confessed to killing Carol to them.
The two men had been in prison with Gordon when he was on remand.
One of the alleged confessions, Gordon Park actually described taking the body out and dropping it into Coniston water. The sentiment was that she deserved it.
The next thing I had to do was try and convince senior officers to get this investigation going again. Fortunately, they shared my enthusiasm and it was game on. We were once again flat out investigating the murder of Carol Park.
5 years after the discovery of Carol Park's body in Coniston Water, the investigation into her murder had been reopened. Her husband, Gordon Park, remained the prime suspect, and officers were now on the hunt for further evidence to prove he was Carol's killer.
Due to a review carried out of the exhibits, we found this rock that had been brought up and put into a bag by a scenes of crime officer at the time, which hadn't really had any great significance in the case at that point.
Because the rock wasn't common to that specific location, it warranted further investigation.
The investigation team decided to consult a forensic geologist to see if the rock could further connect Gordon to her murder. Lorna Dawson, an expert in forensic soil science, reveals how this would be done.
The task of the geologist is to look at the macro characteristics of the rock. So what does its outward appearance look like? What is its colour? What is its texture? And then to look at the micro element to make tiny, tiny slices that can then be put under a microscope. The elements can be identified in those samples.
The geologist compared the characteristics of the rock found at the deposition site of Carol's body to samples taken from the shoreline at Coniston Water and rocks from the front wall at Bluestones, the home Gordon and Carol shared. And when he came to looking at the micro-elements, he made an interesting discovery.
The forensic geologist found calcium rare earth mineral in the sample that was found where Carol Park was found. He also found that same trace mineral in samples that were collected from Bluestone. Now, when he looked at samples from Coniston Water, he couldn't find that particular mineral in any of those samples.
That meant the rock had most likely come from one place: the home Carol shared with Gordon.
It was damning evidence, really, against Gordon. So suddenly the police had much more to go with, and the decision was made that it was time to rearrest Gordon Park.
With this new forensic evidence, in January 2004, over 6 years after his first arrest, Gordon Park was taken back into custody.
Publicly, there was nothing leading up to that to suggest he was about to be arrested. But I wasn't surprised. I'd come away from my time reporting on the case with the feeling that it had to be Gordon Park.
Gordon Park was re-interviewed, and we covered a lot of ground that we'd covered previously. However, on this occasion, he was also interviewed intensively about the knots, his knot tying skills, his sailing records. He was also interviewed about the prison confessions and about the rock. And he was clearly quite frustrated. And whilst he answered the questions, he continued to deny that he'd been involved in the murder of Carol Park.
Gordon was recharged, and this time the CPS believed there was enough evidence to go to trial. This commenced on the 24th of November 2004 at Manchester Crown Court.
I never thought individually that any one of the components of the case would convict Gordon Park, but I was really confident on the totality of the evidence that had been collected.
The prosecution were obviously relying heavily on the knots that had been found on Carol Park's body, and effectively showing that Gordon Park had the necessary knowledge to be able to tie those knots. And also the rock that had been found where Carol's body was found, linking that to Gordon Park's bungalow at Lees.
This evidence from the forensic geologist and the forensic knot expert played a key role in the case against Gordon Park.
They were also relying on the evidence of the alleged confessions by Park to other prisoners. Neither was a totally reliable individual. One of them, I think, was a known drug user. And this was something that Gordon Park's defence jumped on, really, to sort of discredit these testimonies as being unreliable.
There were, however, two much more credible witnesses. A couple from Scotland had come forward towards the end of the investigation, having only heard about the case when it was reported nationally.
The police received a call from a woman. She and her fiancé had been holidaying in the Lake District in 1976.
They had been in the Coniston area, actually in July, and had seen a man which matched Gordon Park's description, disposing of something out of the side of a boat.
He had a large object. They saw that he pushed the item over the side of the boat into the lake, and the young woman said to her partner, "I hope that's not his wife." When news came out that Gordon Park had been rearrested, they finally came forward and gave this description to the police.
They said that the person that did that was wearing glasses.
At the trial, Gordon Park said he didn't wear glasses in 1976, but the prosecution actually found a photograph from before 1976 in which he's wearing spectacles.
That wasn't the only time Park was found to be lying.
The prosecution were very interested in the boat that Park had kept on Coniston Water. Park claimed that he'd sold the boat prior to Carol going missing. At the trial, the prosecution were able to show that he sold it afterwards.
I remember telling the jury about how Gordon took myself and my sister, Deborah, sailing on Coniston Lake. So we'd actually took us sailing over her body.
The defence focused on other people that Carol had been involved with and said that there could have been other suspects in the case. I was really confident that we'd thoroughly investigated everything that was being put forward. And all those things clearly pointed back to Gordon Park being the murderer.
By late January 2005, the jury retired to deliberate.
There was no smoking gun. There was no one definitive piece of evidence that could say with certainty Gordon Park murdered Carol. Nevertheless, that evidence was overwhelming.
Gordon Park thought that he was going to be acquitted. I even heard that he'd made appointments with radio stations to give speeches when he was found not guilty. It was never clear whether the jury were going to find Gordon Park guilty when they said that the verdict was coming in. My heart was beating out of my chest because it was quite obvious this verdict could go either way.
On the 28th of January 2005, over 7 years after his first arrest, Gordon Park was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 15 years.
I think Park himself was stunned. He gripped the rail in front of him. It was a complete shock to him. I think he genuinely thought he was going to walk out as a free man. His wife cried out and his children were distraught as well. I think there was complete disbelief that he'd been found guilty.
For me, at the end, it was nearly 8 years of working on a case, and to finally get justice for Carol, particularly when a lot of people thought it would never happen, was a massive relief, and certainly a relief for the family.
Guilty. I just remember punching the air. It was just such a fantastic feeling that we've got him. We've got him after all these years. And my dad nearly passed out in the courtroom. He'd got justice. He got the justice at last for his sister.
For Carol Park's family, the long wait over.
This today has all been about one thing: justice for Carol and peace for my mother, who died with a broken heart some years ago.
The forensic evidence had been crucial in proving Gordon Park's guilt, but this wasn't the end. Could the case against him withstand 2 appeals against his conviction?
The first one was in the immediate years after he was sent to prison. That was rejected by the appeal judges. They felt this was a safe conviction.
In 2010, Gordon Park took his own life in Garth prison. But some months following his death, his third wife launched an appeal.
But that was again rejected by the appeal judges.
And it was really at that point that the case was finally over. So what had started in August of 1997 was then really finished in May of 2020. I certainly felt that justice had ultimately been done for Carol. But of course we can never wind the clock back. It was a young woman cut off in the prime of her life. It was a very sad thing all in all.
I do believe my dad died of a broken heart. But I think once he'd got the verdict for Carol, he was at peace knowing that Gordon Park had been found guilty.